If understanding your rights clearly, instead of just vaguely, is something that matters to you, I'd really appreciate it if you hit subscribe before you go, because that's exactly what this channel is built around, one real, specific legal topic at a time, explained in plain language without the unnecessary complexity. It genuinely helps more than you'd think, mostly because it tells me this kind of plain language legal content is actually reaching the people who need it, which is the entire point of doing this in the first place. All right, that's the ask. Let's keep going. You're in your car. You've been driving for maybe 20 minutes, maybe 2 hours, doesn't matter. You're thinking about where you're going, or what you have to do when you get there, or nothing in particular, just the road, and the radio, and the specific, low-level autopilot that happens when a drive becomes routine. And then lights appear in your mirror. Blue and red, close behind you, unmistakable. And you pull over, the way everyone does, the way you've been trained to do since you were 16 years old sitting next to a driving instructor, and the officer walks up to your window, and after the license and registration exchange, after whatever reason they've given for stopping you, they ask the question that millions of people answer every single day, without the faintest idea that they're handing over something they didn't have to hand over at all. So where are you coming from? And almost everyone answers, without hesitation, without thinking about it, without understanding what that question is actually designed to do. People answer, coming from work, just leaving a friend's place, was at the gym, heading home, and it feels completely harmless, because it usually is, and because it's a question so ordinary and conversational, that answering it feels like the obviously correct thing to do, the cooperative thing, the thing a normal person with nothing to hide would do automatically. But here's what I want you to understand before this video is 30 seconds old, and I want you to understand it clearly enough that it stays with you the next time you're sitting in that driver's seat watching a uniform approach your window. That question is not small talk. It is not a formality. It is not a courtesy extended to you by a friendly officer making conversation to put you at ease. It is a legally significant question designed to elicit information that can be used to justify things that happen next in that stop, things you didn't consent to, things you had every right to avoid, things that can set off a chain of consequences you never saw coming when you answered something as innocent sounding as just coming from a friend's house. This video is about that question, everything underneath it, and exactly what you should know, and exactly what you should do before you answer it, or whether you answer it at all. Before we go any further, if you've ever sat in a stopped car and had no idea what your rights actually were in that moment, or if you've ever answered questions you later realized you didn't have to answer, subscribe right now, because that's precisely what this is here for, helping you understand your rights clearly, before you need them, not after. Quick but important note before we get into all of it. This is legal education and commentary, not legal advice for your specific circumstances, and laws and procedures do shift somewhat from state to state, but the constitutional principles at the core of everything we're going to cover here hold up across this. It's interesting, honestly, how often variations of this general subject keep coming up, across completely different specific situations, over and over. I think that's because the underlying pattern is more universal than people initially assume. A moment of pressure, a question that sounds simple but carries real legal weight, an instinct to just go along with things smoothly rather than pause and think it through. That basic shape shows up across an enormous range of otherwise completely different situations, which is exactly why understanding the underlying pattern, rather than just memorizing one specific scenario, ends up being so useful. Once you see the shape clearly in one context, you start recognizing it everywhere else too. All right. Let's dig into today's specific version of that pattern. Country. Now let's get into it properly. Let's start at the beginning, at the very foundation of why any of this matters, because if you understand the principle underneath the rule, you'll be able to apply it correctly even in situations I don't specifically cover in this video, and that's ultimately more valuable than a memorized list. The Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution protects you from being compelled to be a witness against yourself. That's the formal language, and it sounds narrow when you first hear it, like it only applies to sitting in a courtroom on trial for something serious. But it doesn't only apply there. The protection runs much wider than that, and it applies specifically to the kind of question we're talking about right now, an officer standing at your car window, asking where you've been, where you're going, who you were with, what you were doing. Those questions, in the right circumstances, are asking you to potentially incriminate yourself, and the Fifth Amendment says you don't have to do that. Not in a courtroom, not on a witness stand, and not standing on the side of a road with a flashlight shining in your window. The Fourth Amendment is also squarely relevant here, because a lot of what follows from that initial question, when it goes badly for someone, involves searches. Officers use information gathered in the conversational portion of a traffic stop to establish the justification for doing more, looking around your car more closely, asking you to step out, requesting permission to search, and in the worst cases, developing what they'll later describe in a report as reasonable suspicion or probable cause to expand the stop significantly beyond its original purpose. Your answer to "where are you coming from" feeds directly into that process, whether you realize it or not when you're answering it. Let me walk you through exactly how this plays out, step by step, in a real traffic stop, because the sequence matters enormously, and most people have never seen it mapped out clearly from beginning to end. An officer pulls you over. Maybe it's a broken taillight. Maybe you were doing 7 miles over the limit. Maybe it's a checkpoint. The initial reason for the stop, in most cases, is completely minor. The stop itself is legal. The officer has the authority to approach your window, and at this point you've done nothing wrong and there's nothing particularly significant to find. But the officer's job, in many departments and under many circumstances, isn't simply to hand you a ticket for that taillight and send you on your way. The job, in practice, frequently involves using the lawful stop as an opportunity to investigate further, to probe for anything that might justify more. And the primary tool available for that investigation, at least in the early moments of the stop, is conversation. Where are you coming from is the opening move in that conversation, and the answers people give are not neutral. An answer that ties you to a location associated with drug activity, even loosely, even in the officer's subjective interpretation, can justify extending the stop. An answer that contradicts something else you've said, or something else the officer believes to be true, can do the same thing. An answer that sounds nervous, or hedging, or oddly specific, or oddly vague, can get noted down and referenced later. Driver stated he was coming from a friend's house but was unable to name the friend. That ends up in a report. That gets referenced when an attorney is trying to figure out why a search happened. And it all started with you deciding to answer a question you had every right to decline. Here's the second piece that most people don't understand until they've been through something they wish had gone differently. The officer asking you questions is not random, and it is not a test you need to pass by being cooperative. Officers are trained in conversation techniques. They know that most people, in the presence of authority, feel a strong instinctive pull toward cooperation. They know that most people feel like not answering a direct question means they must be hiding something. They know that most people are more afraid of seeming guilty than they are aware of their actual rights. And none of that is a criticism of people, it's just a fact about human psychology and social conditioning, the kind of conditioning that makes us answer "where are you coming from" the same way we answer "how are you doing" at the grocery store, reflexively, without thinking, because that's what you do when someone asks you something. But this isn't the grocery store, and this isn't an interaction between equals exchanging pleasantries. It's an interaction with real, significant legal consequences attached to what you say, and the person asking the question is trained to use what you say in ways you may not anticipate. Knowing that changes everything about how you should approach it. Let's talk about what you're actually legally required to do during a traffic stop, because this is where a lot of confusion lives, and clearing it up is the most useful single thing I can do before we talk about what to say. You are required, in virtually every state, to provide your driver's license, your vehicle registration, and your proof of insurance when asked during a traffic stop. That's it. That's the full extent of what the law compels you to produce. In states with stop and identify statutes, which not all states have, you may additionally be required to provide your name if you're the subject of a lawful stop, but you are not required to explain where you've been. You are not required to explain where you're going. You are not required to provide the name of whoever you were just visiting. You are not required to justify your route, your schedule, your plans, or anything else about the movements you were making before that officer's lights appeared in your mirror. Everything beyond the documents, every question about location and activity and companions and purpose, is a question you're allowed to decline to answer, and declining, clearly and calmly, is not obstruction. It is not suspicious. It does not give an officer justification for anything beyond what they already had when they first approached your window. It is the lawful exercise of a protection that exists specifically because this country decided, a very long time ago, that the government doesn't get to make you talk your way into trouble. So let's talk about exactly what to say, because I know the principle is one thing and the actual moment is another, and having specific language ready before you ever need it is what makes the difference between using this knowledge and freezing in the moment and defaulting back to answering anyway. When the officer asks where you're coming from, or where you're going, or what you've been up to, or anything else in that category of questions about your activities and movements, here is the kind of response that handles it correctly. I'd rather not answer questions about my movements. That's it. That sentence is complete. It's polite, it's firm, it doesn't apologize for itself, and it doesn't need to. You can add, if it feels natural, I mean no disrespect, before or after it, but you don't need to. And the sentence works exactly as well without it. What you're doing with that sentence is making three things clear simultaneously: that you heard the question, that you're declining to answer it, and that your declining is a choice you're making consciously, not a failure to understand what was asked. Now let's talk about what happens next, because this is where people's nerves really kick in, and it's where the interaction gets harder to navigate if you're not prepared for it. The officer is going to push back. Maybe they'll say, "I'm just trying to understand why you're out here." Maybe they'll say, "If you haven't done anything wrong, why won't you just tell me where you're coming from?" Maybe they'll say it in a tone that implies your refusal is itself suspicious. Maybe they'll be completely calm about it, but some form of pushback or follow-up is coming. And knowing that in advance, knowing exactly what it sounds like and exactly why it happens, takes most of its power away. Let's address the most common version of the pushback first, the "if you have nothing to hide" version, because it's so common and because it sounds so intuitively persuasive that it's worth dismantling it specifically and carefully. The argument goes like this: innocent people cooperate, so if you're declining to cooperate, you must not be innocent. It sounds reasonable on its surface, but it doesn't actually hold up when you look at it closely, and here's why. The right to decline to answer questions isn't a right that exists only for guilty people. If that were true, it wouldn't be a right, it would be a technicality that only mattered in extreme circumstances involving actual criminals. The Fifth Amendment protects everyone, not just people who have something genuinely incriminating to hide, specifically because the people who designed this country understood that innocent people can be harmed by compelled self-incrimination too, through misunderstanding, through misrepresentation, through the simple fact that what sounds innocent when you say it can sound very different when someone else writes it down and presents it in a context you never anticipated. Innocent people get convicted. Innocent people make statements that get twisted. Innocent people say things that sound one way and get interpreted another. The protection exists precisely because the system isn't perfect, and because even people with nothing to hide deserve the protection of not having every word they say used as potential evidence against them in a situation they can't fully control or anticipate. Exercising your rights does not make you guilty. It makes you someone who knows their rights, which is something worth being. Let's talk about the specific moment you push back on the pushback, because the follow-up to your initial refusal is the critical juncture, the moment where a lot of people lose their nerve and start talking. When the officer implies that your refusal is suspicious or suggests that answering would make this go faster, here's the language that holds: "I understand, and I still prefer not to answer questions about my movements." And then you stop. You've now said it twice, calmly, with the same firmness both times, and there's nothing further to add. You don't need to justify the refusal more than you've already justified it. You don't need to explain the constitutional basis of your right in that moment. You just need to maintain the position you've stated, consistently and calmly, which is all that's required of you. Let's also address one of the most common follow-up questions that tends to come after the original one, because it usually gets asked as a pair. And where are you headed? Same answer. I'd rather not answer questions about my movements. It doesn't matter whether it's where you're coming from or where you're going. Both of those are questions about your activities and your whereabouts. Both of them can be used in the ways I've been describing, and both of them fall within the category of questions you're allowed to decline. Treat them exactly the same way. Now let's get into a more nuanced version of this, the part where I want to show you the mechanism underneath the surface. Because understanding how information from these questions actually gets used will make you permanently more careful about what you say, not just during this specific question, but throughout any interaction with law enforcement. When an officer hears your answer to, "Where are you coming from?" they're not just recording a neutral piece of geography. They're cross-referencing it, consciously or by instinct and training, against a mental map that includes what they know about that area, what calls have come in recently involving that area, what time of night it is, what kind of establishment you might be coming from at that hour, what patterns of criminal activity look like when someone gives exactly this kind of answer at exactly this kind of stop. Just coming from a bar on the north side at 2 in the morning means something different in that mental framework than coming home from my mother's house at 3 in the afternoon, even though both are simple, truthful answers to a simple question. The interpretation of your answer is not in your control, and the consequences of that interpretation can be very much in the officer's control. Here's a scenario that plays out more than people realize. You're coming back from somewhere completely legitimate. Maybe you were visiting someone in an area that has high crime, or maybe you were at a business that's been associated with activity you had nothing to do with, or maybe you were simply at a party that some other guest at that same party was not supposed to be at. You tell the officer where you were coming from, truthfully, because you have nothing to hide, and because answering seems like the obvious cooperative thing to do. The officer hears the location and connects it, in their mind, to something else. Suddenly they're asking who you were with. Suddenly they want to know how long you were there. Suddenly the conversation has developed a texture that feels very different from the traffic stop you thought you were in. And none of this would have happened if you'd simply said, politely, that you'd prefer not to answer questions about your movements. This is not a hypothetical constructed to scare you. It's a description of how investigative encounters actually develop, from the minor and routine into the serious and significant, through the information that people voluntarily give because nobody ever told them they didn't have to. Let's talk about something that happens specifically in the physical space of a traffic stop that's worth understanding in connection with everything we've covered so far, and that's the question of whether you have to step out of the car. The Supreme Court has ruled, in a case called Pennsylvania versus Mims, that officers can order a driver out of a vehicle during a lawful traffic stop as a matter of course, without needing specific justification beyond the stop itself. So if an officer asks you to step out, you're generally required to comply. What you're not required to do is answer questions once you've stepped out. The obligation to get out of the car and the obligation to answer questions are entirely separate things, and complying with one doesn't trigger an obligation to comply with the other. If you're asked to step out, you step out. You remain calm, you keep your hands visible, you follow reasonable instructions about where to stand, and if questions come about where you've been or where you're going, the same response applies out on the pavement that it would have applied inside the car. I'd rather not answer questions about my movements. Let's also talk about passengers, because passengers in a traffic stop are in a slightly different situation than the driver in some respects, and it's worth being clear about how the framework applies to them specifically. A passenger in a stopped vehicle generally has the same right to decline to answer investigative questions that a driver does. A passenger is not typically required to provide identification in every state, though some stop and identify states do extend the obligation to passengers as well as drivers during lawful stops. So this is one of the places where checking your specific state's laws in advance is genuinely worth doing. But the general principle that questions about movements and activities are not ones you're compelled to answer applies to everyone in that car, driver and passenger both. Let's talk now about something that I want to address specifically because it causes a lot of confusion and a lot of unnecessary anxiety when people first start thinking about this. The relationship between asserting your rights and escalating a situation. Because there's a fear that comes up for a lot of people when they think about declining to answer questions, a fear that doing so will make the officer angry, will cause the situation to get worse, will turn a minor traffic stop into something significantly more adversarial and uncomfortable. And I want to walk through that fear carefully, because it deserves a real response, not just a dismissal. The fear isn't completely without basis. Some officers will react with annoyance or increased suspicion when someone declines to answer their questions. Some will push harder. Some will make the stop less comfortable as a result. These things can happen, and pretending they can't isn't useful or honest. What I want you to understand is that the solution to that risk is not to give up the protection by answering, because that protection exists precisely for situations where the stakes are real, and giving it away to avoid a few minutes of discomfort is a trade you almost never want to make. The solution is in the tone and the framing, because there's a very significant difference between asserting a right aggressively and asserting it calmly. And the calm version is almost always both more effective and less likely to produce the kind of escalation people fear. When you say, "I'd rather not answer questions about my movements," and you say it the way you'd say, "I'd prefer not to have mushrooms on my pizza," not defensive, not combative, not like you're reading from a legal brief, just calm and even, and matter of fact. Most of the worst-case escalation people imagine simply doesn't materialize. Because you're not being difficult, you're not being confrontational, you're not telling the officer that you know better than them, or that you have contempt for their authority. You're simply, quietly, in the most undramatic way possible, exercising something that belongs to you. And most officers, faced with a calm, clear, polite refusal, will simply note it and move on. There are exceptions. There are officers who don't handle that well. And if you encounter one of those, the answer is exactly what we've covered. Stay calm, keep your hands visible, don't raise your voice, don't escalate physically in any way, and understand that the time to push back on anything that happens in that interaction is not on the side of the road in the moment. It's in a courtroom or a formal process afterward, with an attorney and the full machinery of the legal system available to you. The roadside is not where you win legal arguments. It's where you maintain your position calmly and clearly, and let the rest sort itself out in the proper setting. Let's go deeper into the mechanics of what happens legally when you've declined to answer questions and the stop continues. Because a lot of people want to know, what can an officer actually do once you've invoked your right to stay silent about your movements? And this gets into the heart of what makes these kinds of stops either lawful or not, which is the question of reasonable suspicion and probable cause. An officer's authority to extend a traffic stop beyond its initial purpose, to keep you there longer, to ask you to get out, to request your consent to search your vehicle, all of that requires something more than just the original reason for the stop. Extending the stop to investigate something other than what it was initiated for generally requires the officer to have reasonable articulable suspicion, a legal standard that means they need to be able to point to specific, concrete, objective facts, not hunches or instincts, that suggest criminal activity is occurring. Your refusal to answer questions about your movements does not, by itself, constitute reasonable suspicion. Courts have been clear on this, not uniformly and not without exception, but the principle is established. The exercise of a constitutional right cannot itself be the basis for reasonable suspicion. If it could be, the right would be meaningless, because anyone who exercised it would immediately be creating the very justification for the thing the right was meant to protect against. What this means practically is that after you've declined to answer those questions, the officer is not free to simply invent the extended stop out of thin air. They need something else. They need something they can actually point to. And if they don't have it, anything that follows from that unlawfully extended stop, a search, a discovery, an arrest, can potentially be challenged as the fruit of an illegal detention. This is the legal mechanism that makes asserting your rights valuable beyond just the immediate interaction, because what you say and what you don't say shapes what's available to be used against you later, and it shapes what's available to be challenged later, in ways that follow from that very first question and how you answered it. Let me walk you through the consent to search question specifically, because it almost always comes up in the same stop where you've been asked where you're coming from, and handling it correctly is just as important as handling the initial question. Do you mind if I take a look inside your vehicle? Or, can I search your car? Are questions that, like questions about your movements, you're allowed to decline to answer affirmatively, which is to say, you're allowed to say no. The Fourth Amendment protects you against unreasonable searches, and a search of your vehicle without a warrant requires your consent or the existence of some recognized exception to the warrant requirement. Giving your consent because you feel like refusing will look suspicious, or because you don't know you can say no, or because you've answered all the other questions and this one feels like the logical next step, is how a huge number of searches happen that people didn't understand they could have avoided. The language here is equally simple and equally important. I don't consent to a search of my vehicle. That's the sentence. Clear, calm, complete. Not no thanks, which can be ambiguous. Not I'd rather you didn't, which hedges and leaves room for misinterpretation. I don't consent to a search of my vehicle, stated clearly, creates an unambiguous record of what you said, and it tells the officer and any court that reviews the encounter later that any search which preceded was not something you agreed to. Now, there are situations where an officer can search your vehicle without your consent, without a warrant, and this is worth understanding so you know what those situations are and don't get caught off guard by them. An officer who observes something in plain view, meaning something illegal or suspicious, is visible without any search needing to occur, may have grounds to proceed further. An officer who has probable cause to believe your vehicle contains evidence of a crime can search it without your consent under what's called the automobile exception to the warrant requirement. A search incident to a lawful arrest is another recognized exception. If a dog is deployed and alerts, that creates its own legal dynamic. None of these situations are created by your refusal to answer conversational questions. They require their own independent facts, their own independent evidence, existing separately from what you said or didn't say when asked where you were coming from. This matters because it means your refusal to consent to a search doesn't create the grounds for the search. If the grounds are there, they're there regardless of your refusal. And if they're not there, your refusal prevents the search from happening at all. The equation is entirely in your favor when you understand it this way. Let's talk about something that trips people up in a specific and interesting way, which is the interaction between being polite and being clear. Because some people, when they attempt to decline to answer questions, do it in a way that's so hedging or apologetic that it doesn't actually function as a clear refusal. "Oh, I don't know. I'd really rather not, if that's okay," is not the same sentence as, "I'd prefer not to answer questions about my movements." The first version invites negotiation. It sounds like it's waiting to be talked out of itself. It gives the officer something to push back against, in a way that's designed to produce a yes. The second version is polite but complete. It doesn't invite a debate, because there's nothing in it that requires a response. When you assert your right, you want to do it in a way that is warm but not wavering, respectful but not tentative, clear but not combative. Tone matters enormously here, and it matters in a practical, physical, in-the-moment way, not just as an abstract courtesy. An interaction that stays calm and respectful on both sides is much more likely to resolve without incident than one that becomes tense, and you have significant control over whether it stays calm through how you speak, how you hold yourself physically, and where you keep your hands. Everything we're talking about in this video operates better from a foundation of physical calm, because physical calm makes your verbal responses sound exactly the way they need to sound, measured, clear, and confident. Let's now talk about something that a lot of people wonder about in connection with this topic, but don't always feel comfortable asking directly. Does all of this apply even if you actually did something wrong? And I want to give this question a completely honest answer because it deserves one. The rights we've been discussing don't come with a requirement to be innocent in order to exercise them. They're not benefits extended only to people whose hands are clean. They're protections that apply to every person in every traffic stop, regardless of what that person did or didn't do before the lights appeared in the mirror. This is sometimes uncomfortable for people to sit with, because there's an instinct that says rights should be reserved for the innocent, and that someone who actually did something illegal doesn't deserve the same protections. But that's not how constitutional rights work. And the reason they don't work that way is important and worth understanding. If rights only applied to the innocent, then the question of whether rights applied in any given situation would require first determining guilt, which would require a full investigation and trial, which would make the rights worthless at the very moment they're designed to matter most. The protection exists before guilt is established, specifically because the purpose of the protection is to ensure that the process of determining guilt is fair and appropriately limited. You have the right not to be compelled to incriminate yourself precisely because the determination of whether you've committed a crime is supposed to happen through a proper legal process, not through an interrogation at a car window by someone who hasn't charged you with anything yet. This also means that the decision to exercise these rights in a traffic stop is not a moral statement about guilt or innocence. It's a structural choice about how much of the process you're going to participate in voluntarily, and that's a choice that belongs entirely to you. Let's shift to something I want to make sure we cover, which is the recording question, because it connects directly to everything we've been discussing and adds a layer that's genuinely useful to understand. In most places in this country, you have the right to record a traffic stop, including audio recording, as long as you're not interfering with what's happening. Dashcam footage, a phone placed visibly on the dashboard, a passenger recording, any of these can create a record of exactly what was said and exactly in what tone and exactly what followed. This matters for the same reason that writing down notes immediately after a stop matters, because memory is fallible, interpretations diverge, and if there's ever a dispute about what happened in that stop, an objective record is worth infinitely more than anyone's recollection. If you're going to record, do it openly, not secretively. Announce it if the officer doesn't appear to have noticed. "I'm going to be recording this interaction. I just want you to know." That sentence serves several purposes simultaneously. It makes the recording transparent, so there's no argument about concealed recording. It often causes the entire interaction to be conducted more carefully and formally by everyone involved, and it creates a clear point in the record from which the audio documentation begins. It's worth doing if you can do it calmly and naturally, and a dashcam that's always running solves the problem automatically without requiring any in-the-moment decision at all. Let's talk about the aftermath of the stop specifically, because what you do in the minutes after the officer has driven away matters more than most people think, and it's a step that's easy to skip because the adrenaline is dissipating and you just want to continue your drive and put the whole thing behind you. As soon as it's safe to do so, pull over or pull into a parking lot and spend 5 minutes making a record of everything you can remember. Time of the stop, location, the officer's name or badge number if you saw it, what was said, in what order, what was asked, what you answered, what you declined, whether a search was requested, whether it was conducted, whether anything was found or claimed to be found. All of it in as much detail as you can recall while it's still fresh. You can do this as a voice memo or as typed notes, whatever takes less time and captures more detail. This record matters if anything about that stop ends up being relevant later, whether that's in a week or in 6 months. It matters if you want to file a complaint about the officer's conduct. It matters if you're ever charged with anything arising from that stop and you need an attorney to understand the sequence of events. It matters if there's a dispute about consent, about what was said, about whether the stop was lawfully extended. Your contemporaneous account of what happened, created while your memory is still as accurate as it's going to be, is a form of evidence that exists entirely because you took a few minutes to create it, and it costs you nothing but those few minutes. Let me now walk through a set of specific scenarios that are common variations on the basic traffic stop we've been discussing, because the same principles apply across all of them, but the specific texture of each one looks a little different, and I want you to see how the framework holds up across all of them. Scenario 1. You're stopped at a DUI checkpoint, not because you did anything wrong or because an officer targeted you specifically, but because everyone on this road is being stopped. The officer at the window will almost certainly ask where you're coming from and where you're going, because that information is used at checkpoints to assess whether to wave you through or direct you to a secondary inspection area. Your right to decline to answer those questions doesn't disappear at a checkpoint, even though the format is different. You still provide license, registration, proof of insurance. You still decline, calmly, to answer questions about your movements. The checkpoint context creates slightly different dynamics in terms of how quickly the interaction moves, but the fundamental rights are identical. Scenario 2. You're stopped and the officer almost immediately says, you match the description of someone connected to a recent incident nearby. This is an attempt to put you on the defensive and get you talking, and it often works because the instinct when someone makes an accusation is to immediately start explaining yourself. I don't have any information about any incident, and I'd prefer not to answer questions about my movements. You're not confirming or denying anything. You're not engaging with the premise of the statement. You're simply staying on the same solid ground you were already on. Scenario 3. The officer doesn't ask where you're coming from directly, but asks it sideways. Have you had anything to drink tonight? Or, were you at a bar this evening? These are questions about your activities that connect directly to potential legal issues, and they're within the same category. I'd prefer not to answer questions about my activities, handles them the same way. The question being more specific and more directly threatening doesn't change your right not to answer it. Scenario 4. There are 2 officers, one at your window and one walking around the outside of your vehicle. The presence of the second officer is a deliberate strategy to make the encounter feel more enclosed and more serious, to raise the pressure enough that answering questions feels like the thing that might make it stop. It doesn't change anything about your rights. Answer the same way, to the same officer, with the same calm firmness. The number of officers present is not a factor in whether the protections apply. Scenario 5. The officer keeps asking, cycling through slight variations of the same question. Where have you been? What were you doing? Who were you with? Are you sure you don't want to just tell me where you're coming from? This is a persistent strategy, and it's effective specifically because most people find it socially difficult to repeat a refusal multiple times to the same person. Each time the question comes back, the same response comes back. I'd prefer not to answer questions about my movements. You don't have to get more elaborate or more emphatic with each repetition. You simply repeat the position with the same tone and the same clarity, and you let the repetition itself be the communication that you're not going to change your answer. Let me talk about something that doesn't come up in every stop, but comes up often enough to be worth addressing carefully, and that's the question of what happens when police ask you questions before the stop itself has even fully resolved, meaning while you're still in the middle of providing the documents, while the officer is still running your license, while the interaction is in a state of flux. The stop isn't technically over, you're not free to leave, and yet questions are already coming. The same rules apply regardless of where in the timeline of the stop those questions arrive. At any point from the moment you pull over to the moment the officer tells you you're free to go, your right to decline questions about your movements and activities is fully intact and fully available to you. There's no phase of the traffic stop where you become obligated to answer those questions that didn't exist before. Let's talk about something I want to address specifically because it reflects a genuine misunderstanding that I hear repeatedly. The idea that all of this is only relevant to people who live in certain circumstances or who have certain kinds of encounters with police. The implication being that for most ordinary people, in most ordinary stops, none of this is something they need to think about. Here's why I think that's the wrong frame. The value of knowing your rights isn't measured by how often you get into situations where they need to be invoked. It's measured by what happens in the rare situations where they do need to be invoked, and whether you're equipped to use them or not. The person who learns this information and never needs to use it has lost nothing. The person who needs it and doesn't have it is completely unprotected in a moment where the stakes are potentially very high. The cost of being prepared is zero. The cost of being unprepared in the wrong moment can be enormous. That asymmetry is the entire reason this information is worth having, regardless of who you are, and regardless of what your typical experience with traffic stops looks like. Let me walk through the language one more time, slowly and completely, because I want it in your head as a complete, clear, ready structure. Not just a collection of pieces. When the officer approaches and begins the standard portion of the stop, you provide what's legally required: your license, registration, proof of insurance. You're cooperative and calm, in tone and in body language, hands visible, no sudden movements, respectful throughout. When the question, "Where are you coming from?" arrives, or its equivalent, you respond, "I'd prefer not to answer questions about my movements." Calm, clear, complete. If there's pushback, I understand, and I still prefer not to answer questions about my movements. Exact same tone, no escalation, no elaboration. If the question is reformulated and asked again in a different way, I'd still prefer not to answer questions about my activities. Same. If a search is requested, I don't consent to a search of my vehicle. If asked to step out, you comply. Calmly, hands visible, and the response to any follow-up questions remains exactly what it was inside the car. If the officer says you're free to go, thank you, and you proceed calmly. That is the complete sequence. 6 situations, all handled by variations of 2 sentences. You're not performing a legal treatise, you're not arguing, you're not confronting, you're doing something far simpler and far more powerful than any of that. You're being consistent, clear, and completely calm in asserting something that belongs to you. Let's talk about one thing that comes up in a very specific kind of stop that I want to address, because it creates a different kind of pressure than most, and that's a stop where the officer claims to be investigating something serious. Not just a routine moving violation, but something that has genuine weight to it. A robbery in the area, a missing person, an active threat. The emotional pull to cooperate in those situations is much stronger than in a routine stop, because suddenly it feels like staying quiet might mean you're being indifferent to something that actually matters. The answer to this is not that you should be indifferent to serious situations, but that your cooperation in a voluntary conversation isn't the only form your engagement with that situation can take, and it's often not the most useful form. If you genuinely have relevant information that you want to share, you can make that choice consciously, with full understanding that you're choosing to share it and why. What you don't want to do is share information reflexively, under pressure, without knowing what the investigation is actually about, and without understanding how the information you give will be processed. I'd prefer not to answer questions without understanding more about what's involved, is a reasonable position in those situations, and if the matter is genuinely serious enough to require more from you, there are formal processes, formal interviews, formal legal channels through which that can happen properly. Let's talk about the scenario that comes up for some people, where this information, when they first hear it, creates a kind of retroactive anxiety about past traffic stops. Stops where they answered questions freely, stops where they consented to things they now realize they didn't have to consent to. If that's something you're sitting with right now, let me say a couple of things about it. First, most traffic stops where someone voluntarily answered questions and cooperated didn't result in consequences that could have been avoided. The vast majority of traffic stops end with a ticket or a warning and nothing more, regardless of what was said along the way. The purpose of this information isn't to make you feel bad about the past, it's to make you better prepared for the future. What you didn't know before, you know now, and from this point forward you're equipped differently than you were. Second, if there is a specific past encounter that resulted in something you're concerned about, something that's still active or still unresolved, the right response to that concern is not to try to reconstruct what you should have said or to replay it in your head looking for different outcomes. It's to talk to an attorney, specifically, about the facts of that specific situation, because general principles like the ones we cover here inform the framework, but individual situations have their own details that matter enormously and that require individual professional attention. Let me take a moment to talk about something that feels tangential, but actually, before I let you go, I want to say one more time that understanding your rights clearly isn't a small thing, even when the specific topic feels minor on the surface. It's the difference between navigating a real situation with confidence and navigating it with anxiety and guesswork. And that difference matters more than people usually realize until they're actually standing inside a moment where it counts. Thanks for spending this time building that understanding with me today. I'll see you in the next one.